Works better. Welcome to Soul Grace. If you've been here the last few weeks, you know that we're going through a list that Paul gives us, the writer Paul. He gives us in the book of Galatians. He gives us a list of 9 things, which you can see on the screen there. 9 what he calls fruits. So these are 9 things that show on the outside if we've been truly changed on the inside. So if the gospel, if the good news, if Jesus Christ dying for you and me, if that's true, Paul contends, then you'll start to exhibit these nine things. You'll start to grow in them. It should be something that we pursue. And we've been breaking each of them down each week to see what the gospel says about it. What is it, first of all? What is love from a biblical perspective? And then secondly, how do we get it? How does the gospel help us to get it? Because here's the thing. Paul does not want us to just try to get these things. See, you could go home today and you can squeeze really hard and try to be more loving. Do it now, try it. Squeeze it. It doesn't come just through the effort of moral restraint. No, it comes, Paul argues, from supernatural change. Something comes inside of you, the gospel message. And because it's real for you, it changes you from the outside. Now, here's the caveat that we've been saying also each week. If you look at all 9 of these, you know that all of us, you and me, we are horribly deficient in these. And why? Because we are, as I've been saying every week, we are a work in, louder, we could do that louder, you guys who've been coming. We are all a work in progress, yes. All of us are in process. That's why we're here even this morning. None of us have all the answers. None of us have these 9 down, and they're incredibly difficult to do on our own. We need some other sort of source of power if we are to get anywhere near these. And today, we look at peace, the topic of peace. Paul throws out this phrase saying, you have a peace beyond all understanding. But at first, you notice what he says first. If you look at verse 6, Paul contrasts this with what? Anxiety. He says, be anxious for nothing. The better translation in English would have been, be careful for nothing. And for those of you who don't have children, you may not get this yet, but you will when you have your first child. At least it got me, because when I had my first child, I was careful for everything for her. You are, it's your first child. Honestly, if they could have made a bubble that was socially acceptable, I might have put my daughter into that bubble to protect her. Because you're always worried, you're always saying, be careful, don't fall down, be careful, don't slip this, be careful, don't eat that, be careful, don't sneeze, be careful, don't do that, be careful, be careful, be careful. And Paul says, listen, that's the image he's giving you. Is that our lives are marked by a series of carefulness, a series of anxiety. He says, don't be anxious for nothing. And he says, but you can have peace. I put a quote in your bulletin, I love it. The writer says, anxiety is like a rocking chair. It'll give you a lot of work, but you won't go very far. You'll feel like you're doing something when you worry, but you're actually making no progress whatsoever. So let's get off the rocking chair this morning, shall we? Let's get off the rocking chair of anxiety, the rocking chair of worry, and look at when Paul says that there's a peace that surpasses all understanding. Now, the careful thing that you need to see when later on in the passage, Paul points out that peace, contentment, is not merely an issue of temperament. See, you know some people in your life, and it probably annoys you because they always seem so calm, and they always seem so peaceful. They always seem so content. And then you're quick to say, well, that's just how they are. I'm not like that. I worry about stuff. Sorry, that's my nature. And Paul says, it was mine too. Because if you look when Paul's writing to the church in Philippians, he says, I had to learn this. He says, I have learned to be content. It's a process. It's a progress. We are all in it. Paul says it's not temperament. Some people, no, it's not just how you're born or not born. He says worry will take everybody. And you and I need to learn. What does it mean to live a life of peace? So what I want to do today is look at just 2 things in your outline. You can follow along. First, what is this peace that Paul is talking about? What is it? What's characterized by it? What's the nature of true biblical Christian peace? And then, of course, how do we get it? What is it and how do we get it? Very simple this morning. First, what is it? There's two things that it is, Paul says. And he says this first, he says that if you, the peace of God will what? Guard your hearts and your minds. That word guard is actually a military term. The better word would be, and it's a word we don't really use in English that much, it would be garrison. He says the peace of God will garrison your heart. Now what is that? That's a nice image, but what does that mean? And frankly, until I moved here to Seoul, I did not really understand the true value of what it means to have your heart garrisoned until I started living on a garrison. As most of you know, or some of you don't, I live on an army base here in Seoul. We live, my family, inside. And in this army base, it's surrounded, it's very large, and it's surrounded, and you know this, by very big walls. And those walls have very big barbed wire on them. And between the walls and between the barbed wire, there's guards. And those guards sometimes have guns. And they have the walls and the barbed wire and the guards and the guns. And you know what that does? It gives me incredible peace of mind. I can take my daughter to the playground, and if I turn around for 5 seconds and turn back and I don't know where she is, I don't freak out. I took her out of the bubble, by the way. I do let her run around. If I go inside my house and I forgot to maybe lock my car, I don't freak out and say, I got to go lock my car. Why? Because being garrisoned gives you incredible peace of mind. Because you know there's a big wall there. And on top of that wall is barbed wire. And between that wall and that barbed wire, there's guards. And you know what that does? It helps you sleep a whole lot better at night. See, first, Paul says the peace of God, it's a guarding of your heart. If you have a peace of God, you should start to have peace of mind. Nothing can get you. You are garrisoned. But secondly, Paul says, he says this peace for him, he says, I have learned to be what? Content in any and every situation. Now what does that mean? Well, if you know the life of Paul, you know he's been in every situation. This is a guy who's been beaten. This is a guy who's been shipwrecked. This is a guy who's been tortured, imprisoned, mocked, stoned, ridiculed, rejected, insulted, abused. And when he says, Paul's writing this letter to the church of Philippians at a ripe old age, he's an old man now, and he says, I've learned something about peace. It's not circumstantial. See, if you were here last week, we talked about joy, and I contrasted joy and happiness. And I was arguing that happiness, by and large, happiness, being able to be happy in your life, is circumstantial. It depends on how much money you have. It depends on how much support and friendship and love and care you have in your life. It depends on how comfortable you are. But joy, true Christian joy, is rooted so far deep down that no circumstance can touch it. And Paul says here, if you want biblical peace, it's going to start to guard your heart to the point that you have peace of mind. And then that peace will remain with you during all the shipwrecks of your life. He doesn't mean that you'll never be sad again. But he says, I can approach every situation. This is Paul. Of all people, he would know about bad circumstances. And he says, in all of them, I've learned that the peace that passes all understanding is not suspect to circumstances. That peace sounds good. Hopefully, see what I try to do at the beginning of sermons, I try to sell you on something. I'm trying to sell you on Christian peace. And by now, hopefully you're saying, that sounds really good. I like that. I would love to have my heart garrisoned to where I don't care about things as much. I would love to be content even if my ship gets wrecked, even if I get beaten. You know that's going to happen to you, hopefully. I'd love to be content in any and all circumstances. This is great, it's great. Get me off the rocking chair of anxiety. How do you do it? Paul gives us 3 really interesting ways, 3 very practical ways. First, it's what I want to call think, and love. I know, I tried to think of 3 things with a TH at the beginning. It wasn't working. Think, and love. Here, first, Paul says think. Now pause for a second. If you were to go to a bookstore today, does anybody even go to bookstores today? Some people go to bookstores. Good. We got some nods. Good. If you were to go to a bookstore today and you go to the section about how to deal with stress, how to deal with anxiety, do you know what they do, what they tell you? By and large, they'll tell you this. They'll give you techniques to deal with stress and anxiety that go something like this. Learn new breathing techniques. Take a vacation. Get away from it. Detach. Don't think. Turn your brain off. Paul says, absolutely not. He says, when you're in the thick of the worst anxiety and worry and discontentment in your life, Paul says, the first thing you have to do is think. He says, think about whatever is true, noble, and right. And if you followed Paul at all in his writings, whenever he says true, noble, and right, you know what he's talking about? He's talking about doctrine. Paul says the first thing you do when anxiety is starting to grip your heart and you don't feel that you're garrisoned, he says, think about your life. Think about the big picture. He says, think about who God is and what he's always been in your life. Think about who God is and what he is in the Bible. He says, think out the implications of your life. Think out where you're going. Think about eternity. And I'll tell you this, if you put that in any anti-stress book, it would never sell. Because when somebody is stressed out, when somebody has a deep level of anxiety, the last thing they want to do is think about the big picture of life. And Paul says that's exactly what you do as a Christian. You engage with God. You go to him and you say, God, you tell me how you've always been true in my life. You tell me how you've always been right in my life. You think out your anxiety. There's a part, I didn't include this in, I've used this so many times to illustrate this point kind of, and I joke that it's the only part of this book, Jane Eyre, that I actually ever remember. It's the part where, of course, she's going back and forth with Mr. Rochester, and Mr. Rochester, they're in love, but she finds out he's married, of course. And he says, don't worry about it. You can still, be my mistress, and we'll still continue our relationship. You have nothing to lose. It's okay. And they're going back and forth and bantering. And she knows in her heart of hearts it's wrong. And she says, she has an interesting line here, and I'm going to paraphrase it for you, where she says, no, I cannot do this. Because laws and rules and truths are for such a time as this when I'm insane, not when I'm sane. And she has an end line where Rochester keeps pushing her, and she says, I put my foot down in what I know that I believe. See what Jane Eyre is doing? In the midst of this worry, in the midst of this discontentment in life, she's thinking. She's remembering. And she says, rules, laws, all these things, they are for such a time as this. When I'm almost insane, I'm going to go back to the foundation. And Paul says, you and you do the same thing. Think. And you will start to feel peace, but it doesn't end there. Paul also says, thank. You see the interesting line if you look back in your passage when he says, go, of course, when you're anxious, he says, go to God with prayer and petition. Go to him, ask him for stuff. If you're worried about your money, if you're worried about your salary, if you're worried about your relationships, if you're worried about your future, he says, take it all to God. But you notice he puts in a little line there saying, with thanksgiving. Do you know how radical this is? Because if you are anything like me, and when you worry, like I worry, and you go to God and say, God, I'm worried about this thing, usually what we do is we play the waiting game. God, I'm worried about it, fix it, and then I'll thank you. Paul says, absolutely not. First you think about the implications of your life, then you think. And he says, by giving thanks, and this is what's going to happen, I guarantee if you start trying this, when you go to God in your greatest moments of anxiety and worry and doubt and discontentment, and you say, thank you, God, peace, Paul says, will start to creep into your heart. Because what you're doing is you're almost taking your attention off of your worry, are you not? If you say, God, I'm worried about this, but thank you for this. What you're doing is you're putting your attention back onto God and not onto you. But last, love, or rather find something lovely. See, Paul says in your anxiety and worry, go to God and give him thanks, and you'll start to feel more peace. Go to God and think about things that are true, noble, and right. But you see the last three that he says? What's lovely, what's pure, what's admirable. These are words of attraction. It's almost as Paul's yelling at us today saying, listen, if you are worried about anything, you will need to find something more lovely than the thing you're worried about. You will need to find something or someone who is so utterly lovely that everything else in your life fades away. That all the worries and the concerns and the anxieties that you may be dealing with start to just fade into thin air. And let me give an illustration of what this means. I call it my French cafe experience. Okay? Now, as some of you know, I lived in New York City on the Upper West Side. And on the Upper West Side of New York City, there's a little French cafe called French Roast on Broadway. And this was my favorite cafe. I'd go there all the time. I'd go there to read. I'd go there to do writings. That was my cafe. That was my spot. Now, let me tell you something. I could tell you about the most odd idiosyncrasies of that place. I could tell you that there was a red-headed waitress on Saturday mornings who always played with her gum, with her hand. It was kind of gross. I could tell you that the men's bathroom door squeaked heavily. And the women's bathroom door never made a noise, which always made me realize that women's bathrooms are always cleaner and nicer and more up to date than the men's bathrooms, are they not? I could even tell you that half the floor of the restaurant was tiled in black and white, and the other half was just tiled in white. Why? I have no idea. I could tell you that the cappuccino machine made a honking noise every time somebody made an espresso or a cappuccino. A honking noise. It was very odd. Now, I could tell you all about the honking espresso machine. I could tell you about the squeaky door. I can tell you about the unsanitary, unhygienic waitress. I can tell you about the mismatched floors. All of those details I knew. But you know what happened one day? One day I went to that cafe, and I didn't notice any of that. And do you want to know why? It's because I was sitting across the table from a woman who was just sitting up here in the front. Now my wife, then my girlfriend. The first time I took her to that restaurant, everything else faded. You see what happened? I had found something more lovely to look at than all of those little tiny idle distractions that I could make. All of that faded away, and there was only one face that I was staring at, and only one thing that I cared about, because I had found something infinitely more lovely than the creaky men's bathroom door. I had found her. Now that's just a shadow. That's just a shadow of what the gospel gives us. Because if you want to start dealing with fear and anxiety and worry, and if you want to start having all of that fade away in your life, if you want all of those little petty contrivances to just fade, you will need to find something more lovely or someone. How do you find something lovely? Well, here's what Paul would say. Here's what I'll say this morning. Look to the cross. Look to the cross and see Jesus on it, dying for you, and then you will know something infinitely more lovely. And all else will fade away. And how do you find Jesus lovely? Here's how you find him lovely in your life. Know that when people died on crosses back in Jesus' day, do you know that they normally cried out? Or they normally didn't cry out, they normally suffocated to death. Long, slow deaths where literally being hung up on the cross, they couldn't bring their chest up to breathe. And they would suffocate. That's not how Jesus died. Jesus died with one final gasp, one painful, agonizing statement, my God, why have you forsaken me? And you know what was happening with Jesus at that moment? He was losing his peace. He didn't die in a peaceful, calm way. He died in agonizing death. He lost his peace so that you can have peace in your life. You see, You and I have to look at the cross. We have to see him as lovely. Otherwise, everything else in our life will take us over. Anxieties, fears, and worries and concerns. It'll eat you alive. If you want to get out of the rocking chair, look to him on the cross, screaming out and losing his peace for you. As we hear babies screaming out as well in the back. Now, let me end this way. Let me make it real practical for you. What does this look like? Let me tell you a story. It's story time. And here's what that peace will look like. If you can see him dying on the cross for you, then that starts to take over your heart. You'll get out of the rocking chair. You'll be garrisoned. You'll be protected. You'll have the peace that passes all understanding. Let me give you a story to illustrate this. It's about a man named Horatio. Horatio Spafford was a very, very wealthy lawyer in America in the 1870s. Now, in 1870, Horatio Spafford, he had married a woman named Anna. And Horatio Spafford and their wife Anna lost their only son in 1870 to scarlet fever. Okay, 1 year later in 1871, Horatio Spafford had put a large investment into northern Chicago, and as you know, in that year there was the Great Chicago Fire. He lost almost all of his money. He lost almost everything. A couple years later, in 1873, his wife got sick. And he thought a good way to give her a cure, to help her, would be to send her to England. So he sends her to England with his 4 daughters now. But he had business, so he had to stay back in Chicago for a little bit. On the way to England, that boat that his wife and 4 daughters were on hit another boat and sunk. He lost his 4 daughters. And Anna, his wife, telegraphed him from England, and she said only 2 words, "saved alone." Now, as Horatio he got on a boat to go pick up Anna in England. Now, mind you, he's lost his son, he's lost his money, he's lost his daughters. And as he's passing the exact place where the boats collided, the captain calls him up to the top deck and says, this is most likely the place where these boats collided and the one sank. Years later, his daughter, in one of her memoirs, he had another daughter, his daughter would say this was the moment, this was the time that he went into a room and he started writing the famous hymn, "It Is Well." Now think about this. What right does he have in this moment, losing his children, losing his money, losing almost his everything, and he says, "It is well, it is well, it is well with my soul." Why? Was it his circumstances? No. He says, "My sin, oh the bliss of this glorious thought, my sin, not in part but the whole, is nailed to his cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, oh my soul. For me," he says, be it Christ hence to live. If Jordan above me shall roll, no pain shall be mine, for in death as in life, thou wilt whisper thy peace to my soul." How does he get the power to write those words? Because he sees the cross. And he sees a God who also lost a child. And it's at this time that Horatio Spafford can say, yes, I lost my child, but he lost his. And he did it voluntarily. And he did it for me. I am saved, my sin, oh the bliss of that glorious thought, is nailed to the cross and I bear it no more. If you want to get out of that rocking chair today of fear and anxiety, look to the one who nailed it to the cross. What do we have to worry about? It is well. It is well. Pray with me. Heavenly